Have you ever worked your whole life for one moment, only to have someone else try to steal it in front of everyone? What would you do if, at your own graduation, the person who doubted you the most suddenly took credit for your success? Would you stay quiet to keep the peace, or would you finally speak up, even if it meant burning a bridge? That day, as my name echoed through the hall and cameras were rolling, my father stood up and claimed my degree like it was his trophy. 7 words later, security was walking him back to his seat. Stay with me, because what happened next changed our family forever. Graduation day is supposed to feel like a finish line. The end of years of stress, late nights, cheap coffee, and silent breakdowns in library bathrooms. For me, it felt exactly like that, until it didn't. I was sitting in my cap and gown, heart pounding, scanning the crowd for familiar faces. My mom was there, already crying. My friends were waving like we were at a parade. And my father was sitting 2 rows back, chest out, like he was about to receive the diploma himself. We hadn't always had an easy relationship. He liked to say he pushed me, but what he really did was criticize, minimize, and remind me that nothing I did was ever enough. Still, I invited him. Part of me hoped, stupidly, that this day would soften him, that he'd just be proud. Quietly proud would have been enough. The dean started calling names. Each student walked, shook hands, smiled for the camera. When my name was announced, my chest tightened with that mix of nerves and joy you can't fake. I stood, adjusted my gown, and started walking toward the stage. The applause was loud, warm, real. For a second, I felt 10 feet tall. Then I heard my father's voice. Not a cheer, not a clap. A voice, projecting, confident, unmistakably his. "That's my daughter. I told her she'd get here. All those nights I pushed her. This degree is basically mine too." Laughter rippled through a few rows. Some people clapped. A few turned to look. The spotlight was supposed to be on me, but suddenly it was. It was on him. On his story, on his version of my work. I froze for half a second on the steps to the stage, my smile glued to my face like it was part of the costume. Inside, something cracked. It wasn't just embarrassing, it was infuriating. Because he hadn't been there for the nights I worked 2 jobs. He hadn't been there for the exams I failed and retook. He hadn't been there when I almost dropped out and cried in my car before going back in anyway. But there he was, rewriting history into a highlight reel where he was the hero. I finished the walk. I shook hands. I took the diploma. Cameras flashed. And all I could hear was my father still talking, still soaking up attention, still turning my moment into his victory lap. When I got back to my seat, my friends were staring at me like they didn't know whether to hug me or pretend nothing happened. My mom looked furious. My stomach was in knots. I tried to breathe. I told myself just get through it. Don't make a scene. It's one day, your day, but he wasn't done. He stood up again. This time louder, more confident, like the room was his. "You're welcome, sweetheart," he called out. "Couldn't have done it without me, right?" That was the moment something inside me snapped, not in a dramatic, screaming way, but in a quiet, steady way that felt more dangerous. I realized if I stayed silent, this wouldn't just be a joke he told at graduation. This would be the story he told forever, that he made me, that he earned this, that I owed him. And for the first time in my life, I didn't want to shrink to keep the peace. I turned around, I looked straight at him, and I opened my mouth. The room was already listening. People loved the highlight reel. The diploma, the cap in the air, the applause. What they don't see are the years that come before. The quiet, exhausting, invisible work that doesn't look impressive, but costs you everything. When my father stood up and took credit for my degree, what hurt the most wasn't just the embarrassment. It was the way he erased the parts of my life he was never there for. He wasn't there when I took my first job in college, because my scholarship didn't cover everything. I remember standing behind a counter, smiling at customers, then going home and studying until 2 in the morning. He didn't know how many times I fell asleep with my notes still open, or how many alarms I set just to make sure I wouldn't miss an early class after a late shift. To him, college was something I was handling. To me, It was a constant balancing act between survival and ambition. He wasn't there when I failed my first major exam and sat in my car crying because I thought I wasn't smart enough to be there. He didn't hear the voice in my head telling me I was wasting time and money. He didn't know how close I came to quitting that semester, or how much it took just to walk back into that classroom and try again. He also was there when my roommate moved out and I couldn't afford the rent alone. I picked up extra shifts. I sold a few things I loved. I learned how to stretch ramen and rice into something that almost felt like a meal. I remember standing in the grocery store, doing math in my head, deciding between buying fruit or buying detergent. That was the version of college no one posts about. And emotionally, he wasn't there for that either. We didn't have long talks about my fears. He didn't ask if I was okay. Most of our conversations were short, practical, and usually ended with advice that felt more like criticism. You just have to be tougher. That's life. Figure it out. So I did. Alone. There were nights I studied in empty buildings because I couldn't focus at home. Nights I questioned whether all of this was worth it. Nights I stared at my laptop and felt so tired I couldn't even cry anymore. I kept going, not because someone was cheering me on, but because stopping felt worse. When he said, "I pushed her," I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so far from the truth it hurt. No one had to push me. I was pulling myself forward every single day. Dragging myself through stress, doubt, and exhaustion, one deadline at a time. The truth is, my father only saw the milestones, the acceptance letter, the occasional good grade. The graduation invitation. He didn't see the process, he didn't see the cost. And standing there in that auditorium, listening to him rewrite my story into something that centered him, I realized how easy it is for people to claim victories they never fought for. How comfortable it is to stand in the sunlight of someone else's hard work and call it shared success. That degree wasn't built on his push. It was built on my persistence, my sacrifices, my quiet, unglamorous, stubborn decision to keep going when no one was watching. And that's why his words didn't just feel wrong. They felt like theft, because he wasn't just taking credit. He was taking the years he never saw and trying to make them his. I didn't wake up that morning planning to confront my father. I didn't rehearse a speech in the mirror or imagine some dramatic moment where everyone would clap and I'd feel instantly healed. All I wanted was to walk across that stage, take my diploma, and finally breathe. But standing there, hearing him take credit for my work, twice, something inside me went quiet in a way that felt dangerous. Not angry, not panicked, just clear. The room felt louder than it should have. Applause, whispers, a few awkward laughs. I could feel eyes on my back as I turned around in my seat. My heart was beating so hard I thought it might drown out my thoughts. For years, I'd learned how to swallow moments like this, how to tell myself it's not worth it, how to keep the peace, how to let him have the last word. But this wasn't a dinner table. This wasn't a family argument behind closed doors. This was my graduation, my moment, and he had just tried to make it his. I stood up before I could talk myself out of it. The movement alone seemed to ripple through the rows around me. A few people turned. The dean paused mid-sentence. My father was already smiling, like he thought I was about to wave or thank him or play along with the story he'd just told. I didn't. I looked straight at him, my hands shaking, my voice steady in that strange way it gets when you're done being afraid. "I did this. Please sit down. Now." 7 words. They didn't sound dramatic when they left my mouth. They weren't poetic. They weren't clever. They were simple, direct, and they landed in the room like someone had cut the sound. For a second, no one moved. You could feel it, that collective pause where 100 people realize something real is happening. My father's smile faded. His face shifted from surprise to offense in a heartbeat. He opened his mouth, probably to argue, probably to say something that would make this worse. But before he could, an usher was already moving down the aisle. I hadn't even realized security had been watching. I guess when someone stands up and starts turning a graduation ceremony into a personal monologue, it gets noticed. The usher leaned in and quietly said something to him. My father tried to wave it off, tried to laugh, tried to sit back down like nothing had happened. But the damage was already done. The room was too quiet, too aware. Another security guard came. That's when it hit me, this was really happening. They didn't grab him, they didn't make a scene. They just stood there, calm and professional, and asked him to step out into the aisle and return to his seat without any more interruptions. He looked around, clearly realizing that every eye in the section was on him now, not in admiration, but in discomfort. As he walked back, I felt everything at once. Relief, guilt, fear. A strange, shaky kind of pride. My legs felt weak as I sat down. My hands were still trembling. My mom caught my eye from across the aisle. She looked shocked, but not angry. If anything, she looked thoughtful. The ceremony continued, like the world always does after a moment that feels huge to you. Names were called, people clapped, caps were adjusted. But something had changed for me, at least. I'd spent so long letting him rewrite my story in smaller rooms, in quieter ways. That day, in front of everyone, I took it back. Those 7 words weren't just about that moment. They were the first boundary I'd ever drawn that he couldn't talk his way around. And once they were out there, once the room had gone silent and then moved on, I realized something simple and terrifying. I could speak up. And the world didn't end. It just made space for me. Watching my father walk back to his seat felt unreal, like time had slowed down just enough for every emotion to line up and take turns hitting me. He wasn't dragged. He wasn't shouted at. Security didn't make a spectacle of it. They simply stood there, calm and firm, and guided him away from the center of attention he'd created for himself. And somehow that made it heavier, quieter, more final. As he stepped into the aisle, I could see his posture change. The confidence he'd had just moments before, the chest-out, look-at-me energy, collapsed into something smaller, tighter. His jaw was clenched, his eyes fixed straight ahead, like if he didn't look at anyone, he wouldn't have to acknowledge what was happening. The rows around him shifted, people leaning back slightly to make space, some pretending to look at their programs, others not even trying to hide their curiosity. I sat there, frozen, my diploma folder still warm in my hands. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was echoing in my ears. Part of me wanted to disappear into the chair. Part of me wanted to stand up again and apologize to everyone in the room for the disruption. And another part, quiet, steady, and new, felt something close to relief. This wasn't how I imagined graduation. There were no balloons in my hands, no group selfies in the aisle, no immediate rush of hugs and congratulations. Instead, there was this strange, suspended moment where my father's footsteps felt louder than the applause had been a few minutes earlier. When he reached his seat, he didn't look at me. He didn't look at my mom. He just sat down stiff, like he was trying to hold himself together by force. The security guard stepped back. The dean cleared his throat. And the ceremony resumed, right on schedule as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But for me, everything had changed. I expected to feel triumphant, or vindicated, or at least brave. Instead, I felt a complicated knot of emotions twist in my chest. There was relief, because the moment was over, because he wasn't speaking anymore, because my achievement was mine again. There was guilt, because no matter what he'd done, he was still my father, and I had just corrected him in front of hundreds of people. And there was something else, something lighter but unfamiliar, a sense of freedom I didn't know how to name yet. I kept thinking, did I go too far? Should I have handled it privately? Should I have just let it go for one day? But then I remembered how small I'd felt when he stood up, how my accomplishment had shrunk into a footnote in his story. How easily this could have become the version of events everyone remembered if I'd stayed quiet. The walk back to his seat wasn't just about him being told to stop. It was about a boundary finally becoming visible, not just to him, but to me. When the ceremony ended, people around me congratulated me like normal. A few gave me knowing looks. One of my friends squeezed my hand and whispered, "That took guts." My mom hugged me a little longer than usual. My father stayed distant, quiet, unreadable. And in that space between us, I realized something important. You can love someone and still refuse to let them take what's yours. Watching him walk back to his seat didn't feel like a victory over him. It felt like a victory for me, for my work, for my voice. For the version of myself who finally decided she didn't have to stay silent to keep things comfortable. That walk wasn't just him returning to his place in the crowd. It was me stepping into my own. For most people, graduation is about the paper, the degree, the proof that you survived years of deadlines, exams, and stress. That's what I thought it would be for me too. I imagined framing it, hanging it on a wall, using it as a quiet reminder that I had done something hard and made it through. But after everything that happened that day, I realized my graduation gave me something far more valuable than a piece of paper. It gave me my voice. In the weeks after the ceremony, the moment kept replaying in my head, not just what my father said, not just what I said back, but how it felt to finally stop shrinking. For so long, I had learned to make myself smaller around him, to avoid conflict, to let comments slide, to accept that my achievements would always somehow become part of his story. That pattern didn't start at graduation. It started years before, in small moments where it felt easier to stay quiet than to explain myself. But something had changed. Once you speak up like that, in a room full of people, you can't unlearn what it feels like to take up space. My relationship with my father didn't magically fix itself. In fact, it got more complicated before it got better. He was distant for a while, defensive, sometimes quiet in a way that felt like disappointment. We had a few tense conversations. A few unfinished ones too, but the dynamic had shifted. He no longer spoke over my achievements like they were his own. And when he tried, I didn't freeze anymore. I corrected him. Calmly, firmly. Without apology. Graduation also changed how I saw myself. I stopped measuring my success by how palatable it was to other people. I stopped feeling like I needed permission to be proud of what I'd done. I had earned that degree, every late night, every second job, every doubt I pushed through. No one could rewrite that unless I let them, and I didn't anymore. That confidence didn't just stay in my family life. It followed me into job interviews, meetings, relationships. I started advocating for myself in ways I never had before, asking for what I needed, saying no when something felt wrong, saying yes when something scared me but felt right. It's strange how one moment can reframe so many others. The day that was supposed to be about endings became the day I learned how to begin differently. I still framed the diploma. It still hangs on my wall, but when I look at it, I don't just see a degree. I see the moment I chose myself. The moment I decided my story didn't need a narrator who wasn't me. Graduation didn't just mark the end of my education. It marked the start of me setting boundaries, of owning my work, of trusting my voice. And maybe that's the real point of moments like that, not just to celebrate what you've done, but to show you who you're becoming. I walked into that ceremony, hoping to leave with proof of my hard work. I walked out with something better, the certainty that my life, my success, and my story belong to me. If this story touched you, take a moment and think about your own journey, how far you've come, and how many times you had to fight for your voice. If you've ever had someone try to take credit for your hard work, share your story in the comments. Your experience might give someone else the courage to speak up too. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that their success is theirs, no one else's. Remember, your story matters, and your voice deserves to be heard.